Every year, Tess returned to the burned-out barn where the stallion vanished in flame, until the seventh year, when a letter appeared in the ashes. No tracks, no witnesses, just her name, a spiral drawn in trembling pencil, and the words, "You weren't supposed to see it." What follows is not a haunting, but an inheritance, one passed through blood, silence, and fire. Beneath the stall lies a secret buried for generations, and Tess is the key. If you think this is just a ghost story, you haven't met the spiral or heard what it remembers. The barn hadn't held animals in years. The roof sagged in the middle. The loft door hung half off its hinges. Ivy crept up the western wall like it had been waiting for someone to stop tending the place. But the girl kept coming back. Same date, same time, every year. Always alone. Her name was Tess, and no one in town ever asked her why she returned. They didn't have to. Everyone knew what happened there. Or rather, they thought they did. She'd arrived just before dusk, park her truck at the edge of the gravel, carry the same tin lantern up the old path. It didn't work anymore. The bulb had gone out years ago, but she lit it anyway. Just habit, memory wrapped in ritual. Inside the barn, she'd stop at stall 4. The one with the broken latch, the one that hadn't held a horse since the fire. She didn't speak when she got there. She didn't cry, just stood for a while with one hand on the rail, her eyes fixed on the far wall, where the scorch marks still curled upward like the ghosts of flame. This had been his stall, the one he died in. They never found the horse, only ash, only char, only the harness, melted and twisted into something no one wanted to claim. And Tess, 12 years old at the time, the only one who'd seen what happened. She never talked about that part. Not once. Not even when they asked her again and again in the hospital, with the white walls and the soft voices and the questions that made her stomach hurt. She'd only ever say, "He was protecting me." And after a while, they stopped asking. But she never stopped visiting. Until the 7th year. That year, something changed. There was a piece of paper folded on the rail, crisp, untouched by weather or wind. Her name written across the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. No one else knew she came here. No one ever had, and yet someone had left her a letter in the stall. She didn't open it right away. Tess just stared at the folded paper, her name staring back in ink that hadn't smudged, hadn't faded, like it had been left there moments before she arrived. But no tracks marked the dust on the barn floor. No boot prints. No tire marks in the gravel, and the padlock on the main doors still rusted shut. She turned the letter over. No return address, no symbol, just the seal, pressed not with wax, but with something like soot. Black and grainy, fragile to the touch. It flaked beneath her thumb. Her hands trembled just a little, not from fear, from memory. She broke the seal. Inside the paper was heavy, slightly yellowed, handwritten. The first line caught her breath. "I remember what you saw." She blinked, read it again. "You weren't supposed to see it, but he did, and he chose you anyway." Tess's throat closed. She scanned the bottom. No name, just a mark, a spiral, faintly drawn in pencil. Not the stylized kind she'd seen carved into fences by teenagers trying to be clever. This was different, tighter, uneven, drawn with a hand that shook. She turned back to the rest of the message. "The fire wasn't the end. It was the lock. You were the key. And the horse, the one who stood with you, he wasn't protecting you from the flame. He was protecting what followed it." The air in the barn felt heavier now, thicker. She stepped back from the stall. The char marks on the wall looked darker, wetter. The letter crinkled in her hand, as if reacting to the shift in temperature. She could feel the tremor of something stirring, something beneath the barn, or within it. She whispered into the dusk, "Who left this?" And for the first time in 7 years, she heard hooves. Not on gravel, not on wood, but above her, in the loft. She turned her face upward, slowly, and saw in the half-collapsed hay door two glowing eyes, watching, waiting, not afraid, not human. The eyes didn't blink, didn't shimmer, they just were, steady and low-glowing, like embers tucked into shadow. Tess stood frozen beneath the hayloft's ruined door, her breath shallow, her feet refusing to move. 7 years of silence unraveled in a heartbeat. She remembered the smoke, the heat that didn't rise from the floor but descended from the rafters, the scream of the stallion, not fear, not pain, but something closer to warning, and the shape. It hadn't walked into the barn, it had bled into it, crawled through fire like it was born of it. She'd told herself for years she'd imagined it, that grief had twisted her memory. But now, the letter, the eyes, the spiral. It was never her imagination. It was a memory no one wanted her to carry. She stepped backward, the boards groaning beneath her boots. The eyes moved, just a tilt of the head. But it was enough to remember the way the stallion had turned that night, pressed his body between her and the thing that came crawling through flame, not because she was the closest, but because she was marked, chosen. She looked down at the letter again. The spiral glowed faintly now, just enough to cast light across the floorboards and reveal another piece of paper tucked under a beam just inside the stall, smaller, older. She knelt and pulled it free, fingers shaking. It was brittle, but the ink still held. Only 4 words. He buried it here. Beneath the stall, she dropped to her knees, scraped back dust, then wood, then metal. A box, no lock, no markings, except for the same spiral etched into the top in rough gouged lines. She opened it. Inside, a halter blackened by smoke, and a chunk of glass. Melted, dark, almost fossilized. She picked it up, and the moment her fingers touched the glass, the world twisted. The barn shimmered. For a moment, less than a breath, she wasn't alone. The stallion stood before her. His coat was still dark, but not burned. His body whole, his eyes familiar. And behind him, that shape again, no longer fire, now shadow, reaching, searching, waiting for its gate. The letter had called her the key. She was still the key, and whatever had followed the fire had been waiting for her to return. The vision shattered as fast as it came. The barn returned, dust settling in slow motion, the floor steady beneath her knees, the glow from the spiral fading back into silence. But the chill remained. Not a draft, not weather, a knowing. Like the air itself had witnessed what she saw and now refused to forget it. Tess sat back, glass still in hand, the letter unfolded beside her. The blackened halter lay in the metal box like a folded oath. Heavy, untouched for years, it still smelled faintly of smoke and earth and something older, like blood spilled for a reason no one ever admitted aloud. The eyes above were gone, vanished. No hoofbeat, no sound. But she knew better than to believe it had left. It was waiting again, like it always had. She stood slowly and closed the box. Her fingers traced the carved spiral once more, deeper than she remembered, not etched by a knife, by teeth, scored in desperation or warning. The spiral on the letter glowed again, just once, and beneath the faint light a second set of words appeared, hidden until now. He kept it here because it listens best in the dark. Tess turned toward stall 4. She stepped inside for the first time since the fire. The boards creaked beneath her weight, but they didn't splinter. They welcomed her. And there, on the back wall, behind the scorched timber and soot-lined rafters, she saw it. A door, small, too low for a person, covered in soot, almost invisible. But it was there. She crouched, pressed her palm to it. It opened. Behind it, a tunnel. Dirt, roots. Something deeper. She didn't need a flashlight. The spiral glass pulsed in her hand, glowing faintly. And the journal, the one she hadn't opened since the fire, fell from her coat pocket, flapping open to a blank page. A single line scrawled itself in ink. Down is not danger. Down is memory. She stepped into the earth, and the stallion's voice, if it was ever a voice at all, followed her. You survived because it needed someone to carry it. But that was not mercy. That was choice. The tunnel was colder than it should have been, not in the way of air and stone, but in the way of places that had not been visited in too long, places meant to be forgotten, not sealed. The dirt walls narrowed the deeper she went, roots hanging like fingers, brushing her shoulders as if they were checking her identity. The spiral glass in Tess's hand grew warmer. Each step forward lit a pulse in the shard, as if it were counting. Not time, not distance. Heartbeats. She could hear them now, not hers, not human, the steady thump-thump of something buried alive. She reached the end of the tunnel. It opened into a chamber no larger than the barn stall above it. Earth-packed walls, no symbols, no bones, just a circle of old stones on the floor. In the center sat a second halter, not burned, not blackened. This one was untouched, still new. But it vibrated with the low, impossible hum of wanting. Beneath it, another letter, unfolded, waiting. Tess picked it up, and the paper was dry, ink fresh. Her name on the top, but not in ink, etched in heat. Tess, this is not the first time you've carried the memory before, in other names, other bodies, but always here, always this barn, always this choice. She swallowed. The page continued. The fire is not the enemy. It is the signal, the warning, the way it crawled into the world. But the thing it chased, the thing that ran here before you were ever born, is still listening, still waiting for the moment you step into the ring. Tess dropped to one knee, the spiral glass pulsing faster in her palm now, casting soft red arcs across the dirt. She looked at the unburned halter, understood finally what the stallion had done. He hadn't died for her. He had taken her place, stepped into the ring, worn the halter, faced what was meant for her. She whispered, "Why?" And the journal opened itself again. A new phrase burned into the bottom of the last page. Because you weren't ready until now. The heartbeat stopped, then started again. This time from beneath the stone circle. This time louder, closer, older. And Tess knew if she stepped into the ring, it wouldn't burn her. Not because she was protected, but because the spiral wanted to remember her face. Tess stepped into the ring. The moment her boot touched the inside of the stone circle, the earth responded, not with sound or movement, but with a deep internal acknowledgement, a pressure behind her eyes, a tightening in her ribs, as if the space itself had been waiting to exhale. The spiral glass in her hand went still, not dark, just watching. She knelt, traced the stones with her fingers. Each was marked, not visibly, but through feel. Grooves and notches, worn in patterns no eye would catch, but her skin recognized. As if her hands had done this before. Maybe not in this life, maybe not in this body, but somewhere. The letter had said this wasn't her first time, that she'd carried the memory in other names. She didn't know what that meant until now, because as she laid her palm flat against the soil, the spiral ignited, not in flame, but in memory. It filled the ring like smoke filling lungs. And she saw her, not herself, not exactly, but a girl, her shape, her eyes, her scars, in a dress made of ash cloth, standing in the ring, holding the same glass, the same halter, but in a different year, a different barn, a different time. The girl stepped forward into a fire that rose without smoke, and from that fire came the stallion, not hollow, but before him, a shape of shadow and breath and bone and something older than death. Tess inhaled sharply. The chamber around her blurred. The stones glowed. She was in two places at once, watching, remembering, and choosing. A voice rose from the earth, not cruel, not kind, just tired. You carried me before, you sealed me in smoke, you locked me in hooves and ash. Will you seal me again? Tess felt the halter beside her, felt the weight of generations pressed into its leather, and knew this wasn't about stopping something, it was about continuing something that had always depended on someone willing. She picked up the halter, spoke softly. "I won't trap you." Silence. Then what will you do? She stood, met the spiral with her voice. "I'll remember you." And the glass in her palm shattered, not in shards, in light, rising, spinning, like a spiral uncoiling at last. And above the barn, the old rafters creaked, as if someone had just walked across them slowly, returning. The moment the spiral glass shattered, the halter warmed in her hands. Not burning, breathing. Tess held it up and saw that the leather had changed, etched now with symbols she had never seen before, but somehow knew how to read. They weren't letters, they weren't language, they were instructions, not for a ritual, for a promise. If you put this on, you do not bind. You welcome. You do not trap. You carry. She stepped out of the circle. The light followed her. It didn't flicker. It flowed, like the spiral had become liquid memory, seeking shape. It wrapped around her ankles, traced her spine, curled up into her chest. Not weight. Armor. A voice rose from the rafters above. No longer fragmented. No longer a ghost. A presence. It spoke without echo. You survived because you were strong enough to forget, but you returned because you were brave enough to remember. And from the loft, the stallion stepped down, not burned, not whole, but restored in the way memories are when finally spoken aloud, sharp around the edges, blurred in the middle, but unmistakably real. He walked into the stall like he had never left, lowered his head, and waited. Tess moved without question. She placed the halter over his head. No struggle, no flare of flame, just stillness. And then he breathed, deep, shuddering, and the spiral in the dirt faded, not vanished, fulfilled. The barn felt lighter, the rafters no longer sagged with history, the air no longer hummed with what if. Tess opened the journal. One last page had appeared, a message not from her, not from a bearer, but from the spiral itself. "Thank you for remembering me without locking me away." And beneath it, "You have rewritten the stall." The next morning, the scorch marks were gone. Only one mark remained, carved faintly into the fourth stall's beam. T.C., first keeper to let go. Tess touched it once, then walked out into the sun, and the stallion followed. That evening, long after the barn had fallen quiet again, Tess stood at the fence line where the pasture met the woods. The stallion, no longer ghost, no longer bound, stood beside her without a halter, his breath soft, his body calm. There was a peace in him now she'd never seen in any living thing, as if being remembered had let him rest in his own skin again. The journal lay open on the post. The final page from earlier had begun to fade, not disappear but settle, like ink absorbed into parchment too full to hold more. She turned the page, blank, until the wind shifted. Then a single line etched across the top in fresh ink. The spiral moves again, south toward the orchard where names are buried in fruit. A new location, a new bearer, a new memory stirring. Tess didn't hesitate. She folded the journal closed, slid it into the satchel at her hip, and looked to the stallion. "We're needed," she said softly. He didn't whinny or toss his head. He simply walked forward. Together they crossed the pasture, under a sky smeared with starlight, the wind moving behind them in quiet, circular gusts, tugging at the grass like it was writing something in cursive only the land could read. By dawn they were already miles from the ranch. Behind them, stall 4 stood still and empty, not haunted, held, and beneath it, in the cooled soil of memory, the spiral finally rested, not erased, not sealed, but known. The orchard was older than the town that once surrounded it. Rows of twisted apple trees stretched across the hills like ribs beneath the skin of the land, their branches low and gnarled, heavy not with fruit, but with silence. The leaves didn't rustle. The wind here moved in spirals, slow and deliberate, tugging gently at every limb as if reminding them, "You are not asleep yet." Tess arrived at the break of dawn. The journal had led her here, not with directions, but with a single line that hadn't faded even after days on horseback. The spiral bloomed once where the fruit never sweetened. Locals called it Whisper Orchard. No one picked from it. The apples never fell. And no one ever spoke the names carved into the trunks. She tied the stallion at the outer gate. He didn't fight her, didn't pace. He simply watched. Because he knew this spiral wasn't like the others. This one hadn't been bound by fire or wind or salt. It had been rooted. Tess passed the first tree and paused. There, near the base, almost hidden beneath moss and shadow, was a name. Lina, age 5. The next tree, Grady, 12. And the one after, Ruth Ann, infant. Dozens of names, too small, too young, each marked carefully, almost reverently, as though someone had tried to remember not just the lives, but the grief. She touched a trunk, fingers grazing the worn groove of a child's name. The bark shivered, and the journal opened on its own. A new page revealed itself, Spiral 192, Orchard of the Quiet. Root-born, grown in silence, each seed a memory unsaid. Tess looked up. In the distance, in the center of the orchard, stood one tree larger than the rest, dead, charred black but still standing. Around it, the apples had fallen, only there, only then. She walked to it slowly. The ground grew colder, and at the base of that tree, buried beneath a layer of fallen leaves, was a stone. Flat, carved with a spiral she'd never seen before, not wide, not open, tight, compressed. Bound so tightly it looked like it was screaming inward, and, beside it, another letter, not sealed, just waiting. She knelt, opened it. Inside, they planted the spiral to hide it, but it grew, and now the orchard remembers too much. You must decide, prune it, or let it bear. Tess looked around. The names, the silence, the air full of things never spoken, and she realized this spiral wasn't dangerous because of what it could burn. It was dangerous because of what it refused to forget. She stood at the base of the blackened tree for a long time. The spiral etched into the stone pulsed slowly beneath the soil, its presence not fiery or urgent, but dense, rooted, like a breath held too long, waiting to become something else. Tess placed her hand on the bark. It was cold. Not from death, but from memory, compressed so tightly it couldn't move. The tree wasn't dead. It was listening. She looked at the journal again. The final line on the page had changed. This spiral is not sealed. It is buried, and you are the first to speak where no one else would dig. She closed the journal, knelt beside the stone, and began to dig. The earth gave way too easily, as if it had been waiting for her hands, as if no one else had dared touch it, not out of reverence, but fear of what might wake. Her fingers scraped against wood, old, splintered. She pulled free a small box, oak iron-banded, lined with dried moss inside. Inside a ring, a ribbon, and a folded note, ink faded but still legible. This is all I could keep. They wouldn't say her name, so I planted it instead. No signature, no date, just a dried petal pressed flat against the page, apple blossom white, long dead. Tess sat back on her heels. She understood now. The orchard wasn't a memorial. It was a refusal, a place where grief was never allowed to speak, so it rooted itself in trees, in names, in silence so loud it reshaped the air, and the spiral at its heart. It had been growing longer than any of them knew. The trees weren't cursed. They were waiting for permission to grieve, And Tess? She could give it. She opened the journal. The page glowed, and she wrote, "Let the orchard bloom." At first, nothing. Then a sound, a single apple falling. Then another. Then another. The orchard exhaled, and from the trees came the names, not shouted, not wept, spoken, soft, real, heard. Lena, Grady, Ruth Ann, and dozens more. Each name bloomed like a blossom breaking frost. And the spiral in the stone? It unwound, slowly, gratefully, not erased, released. Tess stood in the center of the orchard as petals fell like snow, and for the first time since the first spiral carved itself into memory, nothing needed to be sealed, only remembered. The wind changed the next morning. It didn't blow through the orchard. It spiraled through it, curling softly between the trees like it was following the path of each name Tess had unburied. Where silence had once thickened the air like fog, there was now a kind of music, not sung, not played, remembered. Every leaf that fell landed as if it knew where it was meant to rest. Tess sat at the edge of the field, journal open on her knees, the halter slung beside her in the grass. The page she'd written on, "Let the orchard bloom," had bled gently across the binding. A second line appeared overnight, in a hand not her own. "And what blooms must one day fall." She ran her fingers along the words. There was no sadness in them, only inevitability. A shadow passed above her, hollow, still watching, still waiting. His hooves left perfect spirals in the loose dirt as he circled the stone where the tight spiral had once pulsed. He stopped beside her, nuzzled her shoulder once, then turned toward the ridge. He saw it before she did. Someone was coming. A child, no older than 8, walked barefoot down the hill, pants too short, shirt buttoned wrong, and in her hand a page torn from a notebook, held tight like a map. Tess stood slowly. The girl stopped at the first tree, ran her hand along a trunk. Her name was Addie, the girl said. Tess nodded. "I remember. She used to sit with me in the summer, but then she got sick. And after she left, no one said her name anymore, not even my mom." The girl stepped closer, held out the paper. Tess unfolded it. A spiral, drawn in pencil. Careful, precise. The girl whispered, "I think she's in the orchard now." Tess crouched beside her. "She is. You brought her back." The wind shifted again. An apple fell near the girl's feet. Bright red, ripe. The first to fall this season. She picked it up, held it in both hands like something sacred, smiled, and whispered, "Thank you." Tess didn't answer. She didn't need to, because the orchard had become something new, not a place of warning, but a place of return. And the spiral in the journal, it opened again. One last line appeared. Grief does not ask to be buried, only to be shared. That night Tess lit a small fire at the edge of the orchard, not for warmth, for ritual. The kind of quiet fire you build not to keep something out, but to invite something in. The journal rested open beside her. The halter lay coiled in the grass. Hollow dozed nearby, muscles relaxed in a way that said the land had finally stopped holding its breath. Across from the flames sat the girl. She hadn't given her name. She didn't need to. The orchard had already spoken it once, when the apples started falling in rhythm with her steps. She watched the fire with wide, thoughtful eyes, clutching the spiral page in her hands like a lifeline. "If I keep drawing them," she said softly, "will more people remember?" Tess stirred the coals. "Yes, but they'll also feel, and not everyone's ready for that." The girl looked up. "I am." Tess believed her. The spiral had a way of choosing early and choosing right. She passed the journal across the fire. "Then start here." The girl blinked. "I don't know what to write." "You don't need to know. You just need to remember." The girl took the pen, began to draw, not words, a spiral. Small, open, gentle. When it was done, the fire pulsed, not brighter, but deeper. The coals hummed. The orchard rustled behind them, leaves whispering as though catching the rhythm of a story just starting to unfurl. The girl looked up. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Tess smiled. "You never left." And above them, in the branches of the oldest tree, a single blossom bloomed, white and flickering with the faintest trace of flame. The next morning, the blossom was gone, not fallen, not wilted, simply gone. In its place, a patch of bark had curled away from the trunk of the oldest tree, revealing the faint outline of a spiral beneath it, grown into the wood itself, not carved, not painted, grown. Like the tree had decided to speak finally, in the only language that could hold everything it had kept buried for so long. The girl, Addie's friend, was already there, sitting cross-legged beside the trunk, sketchbook in her lap, spiral forming under her pencil in slow, patient loops. She looked up when Tess approached. "She told me something," the girl said, "in the dream." Tess sat beside her, boots soft in the grass. "Who did?" The girl smiled, not scared, not confused. Certain. The one who planted the first spiral. Tess inhaled. That wasn't something anyone had spoken aloud, not in years. The origin bearer, the one no name had ever stuck to, the one who had scratched the first loop into stone, into memory, into blood. "What did she tell you?" Tess asked. The girl looked at her paper. "She said the next spiral won't bloom in grief. It'll grow in choice." Tess felt her chest tighten, not with fear, with something like awe, because that had never happened before. Every spiral had emerged from silence, or fire, or salt, or wind, never from freedom. The journal opened in Tess's satchel, on its own. The ink formed slowly, as if thinking before speaking. Spiral 200, chosen seed, bearer not assigned, location, pending, shape unknown, memory willing. Tess looked up at the orchard. The apples no longer pulsed with withheld names. They simply fell now, one at a time, soft, ready. The girl stood, spiral in hand. "Where do I take this one?" Tess smiled. "Wherever someone's ready to speak." They packed their things in silence and left the orchard behind, not sealed, not sacred, just open for the next spiral, for the next bearer, for the next story that would not be silenced. They traveled for days without destination. Tess let the girl lead. Wherever they camped, the spiral reappeared, drawn in dew on the canvas tarp, etched in frost on the saddle, pressed into the dust where her boots had stood. But they were different now. Not tight, not choking. Each spiral opened wider than the last, willing, alive. By the fourth night, the journal stopped writing on its own. The pages were still, expectant, and when the girl asked Tess why, she answered without hesitation. "Because now it waits for us." That evening, they stopped in a hollow framed by cedar and stone. The girl took out her spiral drawing and laid it in the center of the campfire circle. No fire yet, just the paper. Then she spoke. "This is where it starts." The paper didn't burn. It sank into the earth. The soil rippled once, then stilled. In the morning, a sprout had emerged. Tiny, pale green, and coiled in a perfect spiral. No flame, no memory of pain, just beginning. The girl smiled. "I think this one's mine." Tess nodded. She understood. The journal opened again, and on a new page a message appeared, not from the past, from the present, in the girl's handwriting. "Spiral 201, grown freely, will not be inherited, will not be buried. I choose to remember." Tess didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just sat beside the sprout and watched as the spiral world finally turned, not from sorrow, but from choice. The sprout grew faster than it should have. By the end of the week, it had curled up past the girl's knees, smooth-stemmed, pale-veined, and coiled in a way that mimicked the spiral in her sketchbook, No thorns, no bloom, just the promise of form not yet decided. The girl named it quietly, no ceremony, no flair. Hope. Tess didn't argue. She just wrote it down in the journal, the words gentle and round beneath her pen. Spiral 201. Hope. Grown without grief. Rooted in will. The journal didn't respond. Not immediately, but later, as they sat under a sky too quiet to hold stars, Tess flipped to the next page and found a new line waiting, pulsing in soft gray ink. This is how it begins again. They didn't ride for days after that. They waited, because the spiral wasn't asking to be carried this time. It was asking to be joined. People began to arrive, one by one. Not seekers, not watchers, people. Carrying stories that hadn't broken them, but had shaped them. A woman who carried her father's laugh in a silver pocket watch. A man who remembered the name of every animal he'd ever buried, whispering each one into the roots of his vineyard. A child who had never lost anyone, but had dreamed of every spiral the girl had drawn. They came and sat near the sprout. Didn't touch it. Didn't try to name it. They simply added their spirals to the dirt around it. Dozens, then hundreds, none of them closed, all of them open. The journal wrote again, the archive has changed. It no longer stores only the weight. It now stores the will. Tess closed the book for the final time, set it beneath the sprout, pressed both palms to the earth, and let it go. Not the memory, not the flame, just the burden. And when she rose, the girl was already walking toward the next hill, not to run, to teach. And behind her, spirals bloomed in the dirt. Not as warnings, but as seeds. The world was different now, not louder, not softer, but clearer, as if something woven too tightly had finally loosened, and breath could move through its threads. The spirals were no longer hiding in burned scars, or carved beneath old barns, or whispered in windless canyons. They were blooming openly now, in gardens, on skin, in song. And they weren't just for bearers, they were for everyone. The girl, whose name had not yet been written in the journal because it had never needed to be, walked with bare feet through fields where wheat curled at the tips, forming spirals in the gold. She didn't mark the land, she listened to it. She didn't speak the spiral, she sang it. And when she did, the ground gave back stories no one had ever spoken aloud. A miner who cried every time he heard rainfall because it reminded him of his brother's final breath. A mother who wore earrings made of river glass. Glass, not because they were beautiful, but because they were the last thing her daughter ever touched. A boy who never remembered his grandfather's face, but had drawn spirals since he was 4 years old. They came to her, not for healing, for remembering, and she showed them how to write it into the earth, without fear, without fire. The journal stayed buried beneath the first sprout. Its last written page simply read, "If the spiral keeps turning, let it turn toward love." Tess, older now, walked behind the girl some days. Other times she walked beside her, but she never walked ahead. She had fulfilled her chapter, spoken her flame, planted her orchard. And now the story no longer needed a bearer. It had a chorus. The girl, still unnamed in ink, but known in every soil-stirred spiral, came to a village where no one remembered how to speak. They used gestures. They used light. They etched notes into bark, folded symbols into their clothing, not out of shame, not out of secrecy, but because somewhere, generations ago, something had taught them that silence was safer. She sat in the center of the village without asking to be seen, and they came. They brought her stones carved with curved lines, bracelets of twine tied in threes, stories knotted into hair. One by one they laid these at her feet. She did not ask what they meant. She felt them. Then she sang, not loudly, not with melody, just breath in a spiral drawn across the surface of sound. It wrapped around them, soft as dusk, and the people who had forgotten how to speak remembered how to be heard. The spirals they left behind weren't traced in fire or sorrow. They were woven into baskets, into fences, into food. And when she left, they didn't wave. They planted a spiral of their own, made of 7 different seeds, each one blooming on a different day, each bloom humming just slightly in the wind. She walked east next, where the sky opened like an unspoken sentence. And behind her, the world followed in spirals, not for mourning, for becoming. In the eastern stretch of the continent, where the horizon folded like paper and the air tasted faintly of minerals and rain, there stood a town without echoes, not because it was abandoned, because it had chosen quiet. They called it Belhaven, though no bells had rung there in over 100 years. The town's founders were singers once, choral keepers who believed that words could wound or heal depending on how they were carried. And when the spiral first passed through their hills generations ago, they did not fight it. They translated it into pitch, into rhythm, into sound, without speech. The girl arrived just before sundown. No dust on her boots, no map in her hand. Only the hum of her breath curling gently from her lips in slow, spiral patterns. At the edge of town stood a tower made of iron and oak, tall and hollow. It looked like a bell tower, but no bell ever hung there. Instead, hundreds of wind chimes were strung through its frame, each one tuned to a different emotion: joy, grief, fear, forgiveness, love. The wind carried them all at once. And when the girl stepped beneath the tower, the spiral on her palm shimmered softly, not to alert, to attune. She opened the journal. It wrote a single line across the page: Spiral 212, Belhaven's breath. She didn't enter the town. She sang beneath it, one tone, then another, and the chimes answered. One by one, doors opened. Children stepped out first, then the elders, then the keepers of the spiral songs, those who had kept the notes alive even when the meaning had faded. They circled her. No one spoke, but everyone sounded, and in the center of them, the girl stopped singing, because they had taken the spiral and turned it into something else. Not story, not memory, but language itself. Mara would later say, when she arrived 3 days later on a ridge above Belhaven, that she didn't need to ride into town. She could feel it in the wind. The spiral no longer asked to be carried, spoken, or sealed. It was being lived. At the heart of Belhaven stood a single stone stage, sunken into the earth, half covered in moss and silence. The townspeople called it the listening ground. No speeches had ever been made there. No sermons, no announcements. It was where you went to be heard without interruption. The girl was invited to sit there. No one asked. They simply stepped aside. She walked barefoot to its center, her spiral pulsing in time with the hush. Mara watched from the crowd now, not as a bearer, but as a witness. Her own spiral no longer glowed. It breathed quietly beneath her skin, content to rest. The girl sat, not cross-legged, not regal, just present, and then she inhaled. Not air, history. Her voice rose, not in melody, not in lyric, but in shape, spiral after spiral sung into being. Every note bending slightly inward, then curling outward like a language only the ground could read. And the people? They began to hum, each one a different thread. One old man hummed grief. A mother hummed a secret never spoken to her daughter. A boy hummed a goodbye he never got to say. And in that harmony, the spiral blossomed. You couldn't see it. You could feel it. A collective uncoiling of everything that had ever gone unsaid, finally given permission to lift. The air changed, not brighter, not clearer, just honest. When the girl finished, she stood and pressed both hands to the stage. The journal, tucked in Mara's coat, wrote one final line: Spiral 213, the voice between. And beneath it, the age of bearers has ended. The age of speakers has begun. Tess wept, not from sorrow, from awe, because she understood now. The spiral had never asked to be solved, only sung. That night the sky above Belhaven spun, not with stars, but with sound. Faint tones, weaving through the air like silver thread, arced from the wind chimes of the tower and spiraled outward. A quiet chorus, not loud, not performative, just present, carried by breath and earth and memory, no longer afraid to rise. The girl, the first speaker, stood at the edge of the listening ground as villagers passed by her one by one. Some placed objects in the soil, feathers, buttons, torn letters, a lock of hair, a page never sent, not offerings, not burdens, answers to questions the spiral had asked them for years. Who will carry this when I am gone? Who will say what was never said? Who will listen when no one else will? The girl spoke only once before leaving. You don't have to hold the silence anymore. And then she walked into the night, spiral glowing gently on her throat, no longer on her palm. Because her voice was the key now. Mara and Tess remained behind, for a while. But when the spiral shifted again, this time east, this time quieter, they both felt it in the marrow of their memories. Not fire, not grief, not inheritance. Invitation to speak something new, to carry nothing, to begin without pain. And so they followed. The journal, now full, remained in Belhaven, planted beneath the tower. Its final page was not written by hand. It was etched by wind. Let the world spiral. Let the voice be gentle. Let the remembering be light. The light from the spiral glass didn't fade completely. It settled, dimmed to a steady glow that sank into Tess's chest, warm beneath her ribs, like it had found a place to rest inside her body. The earth around her stopped trembling. The halter, once humming with the weight of inherited sacrifice, lay quiet in her hands. But she knew better than to think the story was over. The thing buried under the stall, the presence the stallion had intercepted, it hadn't been destroyed. It had been seen, and seeing changed everything. She stood at the edge of the circle again. The dirt felt different underfoot, looser, softer, like the memory was no longer trying to trap her there. The spiral burned faintly in the soil, its edges glowing in the dark like cooling metal. Tess took out the journal. It flipped open without her help. A new page appeared, black as charcoal. The words wrote themselves slowly. Spiral 97. The unridden stall. Memory sealed by choice. Bearer survived by inheritance. Witness re-entered the ring. Result, uncoiled. Below that, a new phrase. The stallion chose sacrifice. You chose to see him do it. Both are binding. She closed the book. The earth didn't resist her exit this time. She climbed the ladder back into stall 4, the space above her quiet, the air warmer now, like breath held long and finally released. Outside, the wind moved through the trees again. Crickets returned. The barn didn't creak like it had in the past, like it had been holding back screams. Now it sounded like a place again. Just a place. Wounded but healing. She didn't leave that night. Instead, she laid down in the hay beside the halter, arms folded beneath her head, eyes on the rafters. She could still hear hooves when she blinked too long, still feel the heat of the thing that had once chased her through fire. But now it didn't feel like it was hunting her. It felt like it had been waiting for her to name it. And because she did, it no longer needed to burn. The following weeks passed like a season that didn't quite belong, between summer and fall, between silence and awakening. The barn remained unchanged in structure, but transformed in presence. Tess returned every day, not out of ritual, but out of instinct. The air inside no longer felt heavy. The silence no longer punished her. Instead, the walls breathed with her, absorbing the sound of boots on floorboards, the gentle rustle of her coat, the breath that no longer caught in her throat when she passed stall 4. The halter now hung by the door, cleaned, straightened, restored. no longer a relic, a reminder. She spoke aloud more often now. Not to anyone, not to the wind, but to the space itself. She read pages from the journal beneath her breath, reread the letter with the soot seal until she could recall every swirl of ink from memory. The journal had not written on its own since that night in the earth. But the spiral on her hand had changed. It was no longer visible in daylight, but at night, when she walked the fence line or past the old fire circle behind the barn, it pulsed, soft, faint, steady. The town hadn't changed, not really. People still lowered their voices when they saw her truck drive by, still offered that sad-eyed look that said, "I remember even if I don't know the whole thing." But one person stopped her outside the general store, an older woman in a denim jacket, her hair pulled back in a silver braid. She didn't say Tess's name, just held out a folded paper and said, "You're not the only one who saw what he became." Tess took it, hands steady. The paper wasn't a letter, it was a drawing. Charcoal on rough paper. The stallion, standing in the ring, but not on fire, surrounded by it. And in the background, something else, a figure that looked like a man but hunched, limb long, head too low, too wide, covered in what looked like peeling wood and bone. The words beneath the drawing read, "It wasn't hunting, it was remembering, and it was hungry for the wrong name." Tess folded the paper slowly and placed it in her pocket. When she returned to the barn, the spiral glass she'd thought destroyed pulsed softly from its place beneath the halter. Whole again, it reflected light that wasn't there. She lifted it, held it to her eye, and the world changed. She saw the barn, but different, younger, brighter, before the fire, before the memory. Then the spiral turned in the glass. She saw a field, a circle burned into it, the stallion, her stallion, but younger, and someone standing beside him, not Tess, not the old man from the photo in the feed shed. Someone else, a girl, with the same eyes, the same silence, the same mark. The vision shattered like wind through smoke, and the glass went cold. She sank to her knees in the stall, heart hammering. This wasn't the first time the spiral had chosen her. It had always chosen her, or rather, it had followed her blood, tracing its way down through generations, waiting for one of them to survive long enough to name it. She wasn't just the end of the spiral, she was its beginning, remembered. She didn't sleep that night. Tess lay on the barn's upper loft beneath the open slats of the roof, the stars above flickering like sparks in ash. The vision through the spiral glass clung to her skin like smoke, thick, invisible, undeniable. The girl in the memory hadn't spoken. She hadn't needed to. Her silence said everything. You've been here before. The bloodline theory wasn't just a myth passed down in margins of forgotten journals. It was real, lived, etched not into stone, but into people. And the spiral, whatever it was, wasn't random. It was ancestral. It remembered through blood, through grief, through choice. She opened the journal at midnight. The pages were still, no ink, no movement, until she touched her thumb to the place where her name had once burned itself into the paper. Then a page turned. New text appeared, long, dense, tight script as if written in a hurry. Spiral 34, Ember Lineage, date origin unknown, first fire recorded in Bloodline C, 1816. Bearers, EM, silent, RM, sealed, HC, burned, TC, remembered. TC, her initials. She stared at the list. EM, silent, RM, sealed, HC, burned. Generations, lives, each one tied to this thing, each one holding it in a different way. EM, the girl in the vision. Had she carried the spiral without a voice? RM. Had they sealed it into something? A barn, a horse? HC, burned. Had they died for it? Tess felt her chest tighten. These weren't abstract roles, they were people, her people. The journal continued. The spiral does not choose randomly. It coils where the line allows it, where memory folds inward and cannot be spoken. It survives by passage. It blooms by loss. But once remembered aloud, it no longer needs to burn, it needs to be shared. She closed the book, carefully, hands steady. She now knew her place, not as the end of a story, but as the first chapter ever told aloud. And if that was true, then her duty wasn't to seal the spiral again. It was to find the rest of the line, to trace the path backward, to speak every name the spiral had once taken in silence. The oldest record she could find was buried beneath a floorboard in the abandoned farmhouse 3 miles east of the barn. She remembered visiting it as a child. She ate malpiste, dud child, just once. A family picnic, her father quiet the entire day, her mother distracted and short-tempered. She'd wandered off alone and found the edge of the property line. Old fence posts swallowed by thorn bushes, a well covered by corrugated iron, and a collapsed porch that had looked like it had once been proud. When she asked about it on the ride home, her father just said, "That place holds more smoke than wood." She hadn't understood what he meant then. She did now. The house had no door, only a leaning frame. Indeed, the walls had been eaten by time, plaster peeled, wood gone soft and gray. But beneath the floorboards in the kitchen, under where the old stove once stood, she found it. A box. Cedar, bound in rusted iron, wrapped in cloth that had long since rotted away in places. Inside, wrapped in what looked like char-stained linen, were letters. Dozens, maybe more. Each one signed E.M. Her blood stirred. The earliest was dated March 12, 1817. She sat cross-legged on the floor and read the first letter aloud. "If this reaches you, it means the spiral found me again. It sings in the wood now. It moves in the corners of the barn. He is dead, my brother. His name was Micah. He rode the flame into the west pasture and never returned. But the fire did. It came back different, looking for me. I sealed it into the horse, the black one, the one I never named." Tess dropped the page. The spiral hadn't started with her, or her parents. It had started with a choice made by a girl 2 centuries ago to seal a nameless fire into a creature that would carry it forward again and again until someone remembered it properly. She pulled out another letter, this one shorter, trembling. "They say grief ages us, but it doesn't. It roots us. I am 17, and I have lived 100 years in this body. The spiral sleeps tonight, but only because I forgot my name for an hour. When I remembered it again, the fire scratched at the barn walls. It will always scratch. And another. There will be others. One day someone will find this box, and when they do, tell them, I was not trying to survive. I was trying to remember without becoming ash." Tess stood, walked out of the farmhouse, letters folded in her hand. When she reached hollow at the edge of the field, the wind picked up. It didn't push. It curled, spiraled around her boots. She whispered, "I remember you, Eleanor." The air warmed, and the spiral on her hand glowed like it had just heard its name spoken in truth for the first time. The sun was low by the time Tess reached the ridge behind the east pasture. According to Eleanor's letters, this was where it had happened. The final ride, the unmarked fire, the place where her brother Micah had vanished into flame, and the spiral first took root in flesh instead of earth. No map marked it, no fence outlined it, but the land remembered. The grass here grew in uneven lines, sweeping outward like waves that had once been blown back by force. The trees were gnarled toward a center that no longer held anything, no barn, no stone, just the impression of something removed. Tess stepped into the hollow. Immediately, the spiral on her hand lit gold. Not the red of danger, not the blue of silence. Gold, warmth, welcome. The journal fluttered in her satchel and opened before she could touch it. A single sentence formed on a fresh page. Spiral 01. Origin unfinished. She knelt, pressed her hand to the dirt. It felt like the pulse of a buried bell, still vibrating, still waiting. She pulled Eleanor's letters from her coat, unfolded the one dated March 19th, 1817, the last in the bundle. I can feel him still, beneath the pasture, not his body, his breath. He chose to write into it because I would not. He thought it would end with him. But I hear the spiral scratching when I say his name. Micah, Micah, Micah. I sealed the memory into the horse because it could carry what I could not. But even that wasn't enough. It needs voice. It needs someone willing to speak what was never told. If you are reading this, then you are her. Please finish the spiral. Please tell at the end. Tess folded the letter. She didn't cry. She whispered, Micah. The ground shifted. A wind rose, but not from above, from below. The center of the hollow darkened. The grass parted. And from the earth, something emerged. Not bone, not ghost. A spiral, etched in stone, worn smooth by time and blood and memory. She knelt before it and placed the letters in its center. The journal snapped shut. A beam of light rose from the spiral, thin, steady, and quiet. It wasn't a flare. It wasn't a fire. It was a signal that the first spiral had been heard, and now it could rest. Tess stood, and in the gold light of the oldest spiral, she said the words her ancestor had waited 200 years to hear. I remember you, and I forgive the silence. When Tess returned to the barn, the wind followed her, not in gusts, in spirals. It wove through the rafters, traced the beams where soot once lived, stirred the dust not in chaos, but in recognition. The spiral glass on the wall, long dormant, pulsed once, then held steady. Stall 4 stood open. Sunlight poured through the slats like golden ribbons, lighting up the space where the halter still hung, quiet and waiting. But it didn't feel like a grave anymore. It felt like a chapter, closed, read, understood. She stepped inside and ran her hand along the rail. I found them, she said softly. Not to anyone, to everything. To Eleanor, to Micah, to the memory that had once ridden wild through her chest, begging to be heard. The journal didn't open this time, because it didn't need to. It had finished its last entry the moment she spoke forgiveness into the hollow. A spiral etched itself into the barn wall, faint, not seared, drawn, and below it, a sentence only she could see, because she no longer needed to write it down. The story has been remembered. She stayed in the barn until the last light faded, then walked to Hollow, who waited at the pasture gate. She didn't mount him, not this time. She simply opened the gate. He passed through, slow and sure, stepping into the field, not as a vessel, not as a guardian, but as himself, free. And when he turned back to her one last time, eyes soft in the dusk, she whispered, Thank you. He ran then, not away, but forward, because there were more spirals, and the world at long last was ready to listen. Days passed, then weeks. Tess stayed, not because she had to, but because the land itself had quieted, and her breath had learned how to move with it. She restored the barn, board by board, not to erase what happened, but to honor it. Each plank she replaced, she carved a small spiral into the grain, some near the floor, some in corners only wind and birds would see. Not all spirals needed to be read, some only needed to be felt. People came. First one, a boy who said he dreamed of hooves on fire, then a woman who brought a piece of scorched bark from a tree she couldn't remember burning. Then a man with a horse that refused to enter any other barn. They came, sat, stayed quiet, walked the fence line. And they left lighter. The barn had become something else, not a shrine, not a place of power, a remembering ground. Hollow returned once. Only once. He didn't enter the barn, He stopped at the spiral gate. Tess saw him from the loft, standing still as dusk wrapped the field in amber. She climbed down slowly. No words passed between them, just recognition. And when he turned, he left something in the grass. A feather. Black. Coiled. She picked it up. It was warm. The journal, buried beneath the floorboard of stall 4, glowed faintly one last time, and then stilled. Because the spiral no longer needed a book. It had a place, a voice, and a girl who had once been afraid to speak, now teaching others how to listen. He came just after the frost broke. Middle-aged, thin, hands too clean for someone who claimed to work with livestock. He wore a coat that had seen too many summers and boots that hadn't seen enough mud. When he stepped through the gate, he paused, not like someone lost, but like someone arriving exactly where they were meant to. Tess watched from the porch. She didn't speak, didn't stand, just waited. The man tipped his head in a nod. "Didn't think it'd still be here." Tess looked past him toward the barn. It almost wasn't. He stepped forward slowly, gaze sweeping the pasture, the trees, the fence line. Finally his eyes settled on stall 4. "She rode here," he said, voice distant. "The one before me." Tess said nothing. He pulled something from his coat. A photo worn along the edges, water-damaged and folded twice. He handed it to her without a word. The girl in the photo had eyes like Tess, but it wasn't her. She stood in front of the barn, decades younger. Same slant of the roof, same spiral carved into the post behind her. Her hand rested on the bridle of a horse so dark it was almost blue in the light. "Her name was Lark," he said. "She didn't speak, not after the winter she came through, but she heard things. She said the wind had a story stuck in its throat." Tess turned the photo over. On the back, a single word written in thin charcoal strokes. "Spoken." The man looked down at the earth. "She left me with the spiral. I carried it until it stopped burning, but I never knew what to do when it wanted to be spoken again." And Tess met his eyes. "You just did." He laughed softly, not out of joy, out of release. He didn't ask to see the journal, didn't go inside the barn. He simply walked to stall 4, touched the beam where the spiral was etched, and wept. Not for Lark, not for himself, for everything the spiral had asked them to carry in silence. And for the first time in years, Tess stepped forward. She didn't comfort him. She stood beside him and whispered, "Let it go." The wind picked up. The spiral shimmered in the grain, and the barn listened. The photo of Lark never left Tess's hand. After the man departed, quiet as he came, walking the same trail back with dust rising behind him like old breath, the barn seemed to shift again, not physically, spiritually, as if another weight had been set down. She laid the photo beneath the floorboards of stall 4, beside the journal and the black halter. A small shrine, not one meant for worship, one meant for remembering without having to speak aloud. That night the wind came early. It didn't knock. It entered, wove through the rafters, danced across the hay, found the spiral burned into the main beam, and sang through it. A low hum, a tone without name, the same sound Lark must have heard, what she meant when she said the wind had a story stuck in its throat. Tess lit a lantern and climbed to the loft. The light caught something on the far wall, fresh, faint, a new spiral, not carved, not burned, condensed, as if the memory had pressed so hard against the wood it finally left a mark. It was different than the others, tighter at the center, open wide at the end, a reversal. She touched it, felt spoken words rise into her head, not her own. Some spirals don't want to be sealed. They want to be said. Let the breath remember what the hands were too afraid to write. She staggered back, breath shaking. The journal flipped itself open below, even in its resting place. Pages turning, faster than before. Then still. New ink. Spiral 214, spoken, unwritten line carried through oral memory. Voice born, half heard, never recorded, activated through acknowledgement. Bearer, LM. Witness, TC. She traced her fingers over the page. Lark's spiral hadn't been forgotten. It had just never been written down. But it had lived, in breath, in tone, in sound, passed down from barn to wind to horse to girl. And now it had returned, because someone finally stood still long enough to listen. The next morning, Tess heard it. Not the wind, not the spiral hum, a voice, low, clear, repeating. A song with no melody, sung from somewhere in the orchard behind the barn. She stepped outside, boots soft in the dew, and followed the sound across the pasture. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo. But it carried. The kind of sound that didn't want attention. It wanted acknowledgement. At the far edge of the orchard stood a young man in a long brown coat, hat tucked under his arm, head bowed. He didn't look up when she approached, just kept singing. It wasn't a language she knew, but she understood it. Every word spiraled inward, then opened wide again, like breath passing through generations. A name was buried in the rhythm, a name not meant to be spoken, but sung. She waited until the last note left his mouth, then asked, "Who taught you that?" He looked up, eyes gray as smoke. "My grandmother," he said. "She used to hum it while brushing the horses. Said it came from a barn that never burned." Tess swallowed. "Did she have a spiral?" He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded piece of cloth, unwrapped it. Inside, a carved stone, no bigger than a palm. A spiral chiseled into it, with perfect lines. "She said this one couldn't be buried," he said. "It would forget how to speak if it ever touched dirt." He handed it to Tess. It vibrated in her hands. Not magic. Memory. The journal opened without her touching it. A new page. Spiral 215. Voice stone. Origin unknown. Line, oral keeper lineage. Risk high. If unspoken for more than 100 years, memory collapses inward. Song required to maintain spiral integrity. Carrier BM. Witness TC. The man, BM, smiled gently. "I've sung it every season since she passed, but it's fading. I needed someone who could help it survive without me." Tess looked at the spiral, then back at him. "You came to the right place." Tess brought the voice stone into the barn like it was a heartbeat pulled from time. She placed it beneath the rafters of stall 4, where the wind moved in deliberate spirals now, where memory didn't echo, it resonated. The stone didn't glow, it didn't hum, it simply waited. Later that night she sat in the loft with the journal, the barn wrapped in silence so complete it felt ceremonial. The man, BM, slept near the edge of the fence, curled in his coat, his voice finally resting after weeks of keeping the spiral alive with song. Tess studied the page again. If unspoken for more than 100 years, memory collapses inward. She read it aloud. And when she did, the spiral on the stone responded, not with movement, but with tone. A single low chord filled the barn, not from her mouth, from the air itself. The stone had been listening for generations, and now that it had been named, it could finally exhale. Tess opened the journal to the next page and began to write. Spiral 215, the stone that waited. Kept alive, not in paper, not in fire, but in breath. Passed from voice to voice, body to body. Its shape held not in sight, but in sound memory. It survived because someone sang. She paused, then added one last line. And now it will be heard by more than one. Over the coming days she taught the song to others, not to memorize, to feel. The children sang it to the horses. The elders hummed it into the beams of old homes. The spiral reshaped itself into a community rhythm, not a chant, not a warning, but a shared breath. And the voice stone, it softened over time. Its spiral remained, but the edge dulled. Not because it was forgotten, because it was safe now. Tess smiled as she watched the barn glow in the late afternoon. The spirals had stopped arriving in panic, in flame, in wind-borne warnings. They came now in rhythm, in sound, in peace. The first dream spiral appeared in early spring. Tess hadn't expected it, not in this season, not in this new age of peace, but it came all the same. She woke gasping, the taste of river water in her mouth, her hands clenched around nothing. The spiral on her palm, quiet for weeks, had flared in her sleep, pulsing through bone and breath like a signal without language. She staggered out of bed and found the journal already open on the table. A fresh page, unmarked, but damp, not with ink, with memory. She touched it and the dream returned, not in images, but in emotion. A field soaked in fog, a tree with no leaves but thousands of names carved into its roots, and above it all, a spiral not seen with eyes, but felt in the skin. It had not been spoken, not carried, not carved. It had written itself into her dream. And she wasn't the only one. By noon, 3 others had come to the barn. One, a boy from the next town over, eyes ringed with exhaustion, saying, "I think I saw your tree." Another, a woman who whispered, "I don't know how I got here, but I followed the spiral in my sleep." And a third, silent, shaking, who simply opened his hand and revealed a spiral etched into the callus of his palm. None of them knew each other. All of them had dreamed the same shape. Tess wrote in the journal, her hand steady. Spiral 216, the dream route, untraceable by wind, fire, salt, or blood. Emergent through shared subconscious recall. First appearance, simultaneous. No known origin bearer. Memory status, distributed. She looked up, at the 3 of them sitting in the barn, at the way the spirals seemed to grow in them, not heavy, not hungry, but anchoring. For the first time, Tess didn't know what the spiral wanted, and she didn't need to, because maybe it had evolved beyond needing a single bearer. Maybe it had become the world's way of remembering itself, together. They called themselves the Dream Root Circle, not officially, not in any kind of organized way. It started with Tess and the 3 who came to the barn after the dream. Then others began to arrive. A teenager who sketched spirals in her sleep and found them matching carvings from halfway across the world. A retired coal miner who spoke a language he had forgotten years ago, fluently, but only in dreams. A midwife who claimed her last 3 deliveries were all spiral-marked children. They didn't meet regularly. There were no formal rites, just a growing network of people waking in the middle of the night with the same image behind their eyes. A tree without leaves, roots like veins, and a spiral cut into the sky above it, spinning not clockwise, not counterclockwise, but inward. Tess began logging them. Spiral 217, the root singer, a woman whose humming caused the barn floor to resonate. Spiral 218, the reversed echo, a man who dreamed of a fire unburning. Spiral 219, the hollowed field, 5 people all in different towns who simultaneously dreamed of a place that never existed, but left them with mud on their shoes. The journal was no longer a book. It was a mirror. Pages filled themselves before ink touched them. Sometimes Tess would reach for the journal only to find an entry had already begun, written in a hand that was hers but didn't feel human. And always at the end of each entry, the same sentence appeared. This memory chose to return. One evening, as dusk lowered the color of the sky into deep amethyst, a child no older than 4 wandered into the barn, led by no one, barefoot, quiet. He carried a pine cone cupped in both palms. Inside the cone, a spiral. Perfect, natural, grown. He handed it to Tess and said, "The tree remembers being a seed." That night, Spiral 220 wrote itself into the journal, the memory that grows backward. The pine cone didn't dry out. It didn't crumble. It sat on the table in the barn, day after day, unchanged, like time had stepped around it. The spiral at its center remained tight, perfect, and oddly warm to the touch, as though it carried a memory older than the tree it had fallen from. Tess kept it beside the journal, not as an artifact, as a listener. The next dream came a week later. Not to Tess, to the stallion. She found him standing outside the barn in the dead of night, eyes wide but calm, breath slow and deep, like a bellows remembering its rhythm. The spiral on his flank, long since faded, glowed faintly again, traced in moonlight and something deeper. He pawed at the earth once, twice, then walked into the orchard. Tess followed without question. He stopped in front of the oldest tree, the one that had first bloomed when the orchard accepted grief. He lowered his head and dug, not violently, deliberately. At the base of the roots, something glinted. Tess dropped to her knees and helped uncover it. A fossil, but not of bone, of memory, a spiral, stone-pressed, ridged like bark, coiled tighter than any before it. It radiated not heat, not sound, but weight, like it had been carried for centuries before settling here. She placed her hand on it, and the dream returned, not as vision, as inheritance. The stallion, not hers, not hollow, the one before, and the one before that, back and back and back, through hooves and fields and names forgotten in ink, but kept alive in stride, each one bearing a spiral, not as burden, as instinct. Spiral 221 wrote itself into the journal that night, the bearer without words, lineage unbroken, spoken only in breath and movement. The spiral rides. Tess looked to the stallion, standing still under the stars, and understood some spirals didn't need journals. They were already written, in the gallop,